Hey everyone, Joe Von D here, and with this review, my goal is to look at The Last of Us Part 2 from a game developer's perspective, in an attempt to understand all of the different aspects that make the experience enjoyable or not enjoyable, and give it a final grade out of 100 in a fair and balanced assessment. And throughout the review, I'll try to give my opinion on how I would have done things differently if I didn't enjoy them. A little background, if you're not familiar with the channel, I make YouTube videos to help you develop your own games and to help you get in the mindset of a video game developer. And I think a deep analysis of a controversial game is another great way to help you do that. I'm coming at this as a huge fan of the first game. The Last of Us is my second favorite game that I've ever played. And I'm going into this as a continuation of that game since it's literally called Part 2. Mostly meaning I'm fond of the two protagonists of the first game, and I came with expectations of seeing more of their relationship after the events of that game. I will not be covering the controversial false advertisement claims levied against the studio, nor the reported exploitation of labor that the studio has been accused of. This video is solely focused on the final product, shipped on launch day. If you know nothing about the Last of Us series, first of all, I'd recommend that you play the games for yourself before watching this video, but just so you know, the first game takes place 20 years after a zombie-like plague has utterly decimated mankind. Every location in both games is either empty or completely filled with infected, with the exception of a handful of fortified areas. I'll be grading the game in multiple different sections: visuals, audio, story and storytelling, characters, gameplay, and technicals. I think if there are any objections to this review, it'll likely come from the scoring breakdowns. Not every section is worth the same amount of points. This is a narrative-driven game, so I believe that story and storytelling should have a larger effect on the overall score than it normally would on another type of game, like, let's say, a MOBA. Different games, in my opinion, require different grading scales depending on its main features. In this case, the story will be worth 30% of the overall score, gameplay worth the second most at 25%, characters worth the third most at 15%, and visuals, audio, and technicals at 10% each. Also, when assigning a score, I want everyone to keep in mind that for each section, a full score like a 10 out of 10 or a 30 out of 30 would be equivalent to the best I've ever experienced in any video game ever. And a 0 in a category would be the worst that I've ever experienced. So half of that category's maximum, like a 5 out of 10 or 15 out of 30, would be equivalent to a decent or average game. I use this scale for grading all entertainment mediums since it's easy to understand and it also scales in each section. I believe this is a fairly reasonable way to assess such a complex entertainment medium. And note that different sections will have their timestamps in the description box down below. So let's get on to the review. Visuals. Starting off with the category of visuals, we should talk about the locations in the game. There are multiple different settings in The Last of Us Part 2, ranging from Jackson, Wyoming, to Seattle, Washington, and finally, Santa Barbara, California. With a flashback or two set in Salt Lake City, Utah, the location of the finale in the first game. These locations are very distinct from one another, and also are visited during different seasons, which helps further diversify their visual aesthetics. The player spends most of the time in Seattle, a total of 6 days between two different characters, and I would say that this is one of the first issues that I have, as Seattle is visually the least interesting of the locations in the game to me. So many areas in Seattle have a dark gray and blue palette since it's constantly storming, overcast, or you're underground, inside of a building, or surviving during the night. The colors do become bleak, which capitalizes on the darkness of the overall narrative, but does become visually uninteresting once you go deep into the story. The flashback sequences do have a different palette, but they're so short in comparison to the days in Seattle that when you return to present day, it becomes stale rather quickly. I do need to give credit to the developers for changing the scenery in Seattle during important story sections. The most obvious example is Haven. When the entire island is lit ablaze while you try to escape, this was an absolutely stunning visual sequence. My favorite location in the game is Santa Barbara, which will come as no surprise to anyone who knows me. I'm from California and visit California often, so I'm definitely biased in favor of this location. It was amazing to see streets similar to the ones that I grew up on infested with the infected. I'm sure other people got this rush in other locations that are similar to their homes, but I always love that added bit of familiarity in video games set in real-world locations. I do wish your time spent in Santa Barbara was longer, since the location was incredibly vibrant. The faction there was more interesting to me than the WLF or the Seraphites, plus the gameplay was more interesting as well, but we'll get into that in later sections. Outdoor environmental design. We've talked about the different settings, now let's talk more about the outdoor environmental design. I want to mention the small open world area in the beginning of Seattle. This area was one of my favorites. Although the map was very well executed and easy to use, the environment was structured in such a simplistic grid that it was basically impossible to get lost. I consider that simplistic grid design to be a positive aspect though, although I can see other players preferring a more complicated area to traverse. I will say that due to this simplistic design choice, there are very few hidden locations in this section and no randomly generated infected spawns, thus allowing for very little replayability, which we'll probably see as a recurring theme. On the whole, the outdoor environmental design in this game is great. It's filled with high quality assets, incredible lighting, even when it's overcast, and best of all, tells great stories with its design alone. Some areas are littered with attacked vehicles filled with corpses, some areas simply decayed due to decades of erosion, and many have been taken over by nature. Yet another reminder of the Cordyceps' dominance over the world. This is a direct extension of the first game, and I loved every bit of it. Indoor environmental design. Transitioning to indoor environmental design, I was also very impressed with the multitude of new indoor locations that we got to see. Of course, we got more of what we liked from the first game, such as residential areas, another school, large industrial buildings, and ransacked stores, but the sequel really upped the ante, giving us unique areas like a bank, with a small minor story about a group of bank robbers attempting to rob the bank on Outbreak Day. Probably seemed like a smart idea at the time. A museum, an aquarium, a martial arts dojo, a synagogue, a TV broadcasting tower, a music store, a few hotels, and if you didn't know, I was a hotel manager for about 5 years, so these hotels were particularly interesting locations for me. You also get to visit a Ground Zero hospital quarantine zone, which is one of my favorites, especially since the infection continuously grows over time, so you're able to see the most advanced cases since you're going to where it first began in this region. And there's plenty of other amazing indoor locations explored as well. Each area is not only highly detailed, but is also designed as though it's been scavenged time and time again. A multitude of areas have spore growths in corners and on the walls, and they give a visual indication of infected around, which is a nice environmental heads up telling you to stay cautious. I really enjoyed the indoor environments in this game. The Last of Us has one of my favorite post-apocalyptic worlds, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. Graphics. Let's talk about graphics. I'm sure you can tell I am floored by the graphics and realism in this game. The different factions in the game have differing aesthetic design choices. The Jackson crew are dressed in civilian outdoor attire, everyday sort of clothing that you and I might wear, symbolizing that they are the ones to identify with. They have the most normal aesthetic. The WLF, in contrast, is a militaristic faction with camo pants and rugged boots, radio equipment, and more of an infantry military type feel. This lets players know right off the bat that this group is organized, effective, and deadly. The Seraphites, or Scars, are hooded, robed figures that use primitive communication methods like whistling. Their design and dialogue clearly show that they're religious zealots attempting to abandon the old world while spreading their religion. Fedra isn't shown in this game, and the Fireflies only make appearances in flashbacks, but their aesthetics haven't changed from the first game. The final faction is the Rattlers, a bandit gang of slavers in Santa Barbara. Aesthetically, they're a cross between a biker gang and the military. Not my favorite blend, but their base of operations is visually spectacular, as they run their slave ring out of what reminds me of the Spanish missions in California, but it could just be a large mansion on the coast. Overall, the differing aesthetics allows players to easily differentiate which characters are enemies and which are allies. Oh, and don't let me forget about the infected. They're unchanged from the first game, however they do have two new infected forms, the Shamblers and the so far unique Rat King. These are welcome additions by me as their designs are horrifying, especially the Rat King, and their inclusion adds additional variation to the game. Transitioning to the overall graphics in the game, we need to start off with the characters. The first Last of Us game came out at the end of its console generation's life cycle and pushed that technology to the limit. I believe The Last of Us 2 has done the same with the PS4. The character models are incredibly detailed, the textures are very high resolution, the lighting used to light them in each scene is breathtaking, the eyes have improved dramatically from the last generation, the hair sway during gameplay is honestly a bit exaggerated, but very accurate during cutscenes. The skin deformations, when the knife is being pressed up against skin or faces being shoved into the ground, are completely eye-catching. All of this on top of some of the best motion capture in the animation business. Honestly, I can't praise Naughty Dog and its team enough on how visually stunning these characters are, at least the ones from Jackson. Many of the WLF and Scars look a bit generic, like Owen, who looks like a more boring Iceman from X-Men, but either way, the character models are highly detailed, even if their designs aren't always eye-catching. But the phenomenal details in this game don't stop there. The environmental graphics are just as impressive, such as auto exposure and eye adaptation while going into darker areas, reactive foliage that reacts to force velocities, the amazing water and caustics from light bounces in the water, which is cheated by the way. The caustics are just a material effect applied to the geometry beneath the water, but still a smart and efficient way to use resources. There are tiny details such as enemies killed in snow will bleed onto the snow and the heat from that blood will melt the snow. Glass breaks differently depending on how it's damaged, localized damage on static meshes, guitar strings vibrate when they're played, although this effect is slightly exaggerated as well, it's still a nice touch. Snow on branches will fall off if forces are applied to the branch that it sits on. Notes in the game are all written in unique handwriting. Ellie's tattoo is outlined in the flashback with Tommy and then fully inked by the start of the game. There's moisture buildup on the inside of Ellie's helmet when she breathes in the museum. I can go on and on about these amazing details. Another thing I want to touch on is that I enjoy how they did the particle effects for the spores. Viewing the spores in enclosed areas is very unique. They're difficult to see in certain lighting conditions, but stick out with the flashlight on. In combination with the growths indoors, in the corners and on the walls, it really gives the player this grossed out feeling, and that's how you know they did a good job. Other small additions were welcomed as well. The character Abby is afraid of heights, and when you're near a ledge with a large fall, a dolly zoom occurs for that Jaws-like effect, also known as the vertigo effect. There's some slight post-processing with the colors, and her animation and breathing shows she's particularly vulnerable due to this fear of heights. A few areas I think could use some improvement begin with the footprints in the snow. The footprint effects are good, however, I think Red Dead Redemption 2 had more realistic and accurate footprints. The characters and horses in this game don't really lift their feet very high, so it just leaves a streak of snow deformations, where Red Dead Redemption 2 has individual footprints with their locations dependent on the character model's foot locations. Still, overall, the snow trails do look good. Another thing to touch on is the garbage inside of most garbage cans appears relatively normal from long distances, not particularly interesting. One of the benefits of having a third-person character is that the camera usually doesn't get too close to any specific asset. However, if you scope in on the garbage, it appears to just be some normal and displacement maps on top of the bag material instead of actual geometry for the garbage. Also, there's quite a few signs and posters with very low resolution textures around the game if you use your rifle to scope in and look at them up close. This is to be expected on the PS4 hardware, but I was confused by some of the choices because somewhat meaningless assets like hand dryers had easy to read textures, but other more interesting assets like posters on the wall had very difficult to read low resolution textures. I also wish there was a bit more interaction with wildlife. You can see birds, rabbits, squirrels, and I think I even saw a little goat once, but they mostly just run away. That concludes the first major section of this review, the game's visuals. And I think I've made it clear that I am impressed with multiple aspects of the visuals and designs in this game, many of which are carried over and improved upon from its predecessor. I think we'll consider this game in the top tier of visuals in the PlayStation 4 era, along with Red Dead Redemption 2, Marvel's Spider-Man, Horizon Zero Dawn, and Uncharted 4. But no game is perfect. I pointed out a few things that I would have changed or improved on in the final build, and the game has many long stretches with very bland and dreary color palettes, so I think a fair score is a 9.4 out of 10 for the visuals in The Last of Us Part 2. Audio. The next major section of this review is for the audio in the game. Keep in mind, I'm not an audiophile, and on most projects I've worked on, I haven't been a big part of the audio design. Musical score. If you played the first game, you already know the musical score is going to be fantastic. They brought back Gustavo and his incredibly distinct guitar instrumentals. The new additions to the soundtrack are filled with heart and filled with emotion. I would consider them modern masterpieces. You can feel the loneliness and the pain in the world through this soundtrack. Whether you enjoy this game or not, do yourself a favor by listening to the soundtrack and you'll have a clearer understanding of what this world is really like. I particularly like the tracks Longing, It Can't Last, and Beyond Desolation. Now, are these songs that you would likely bump in your car for weeks on end? Definitely not, but they are incredible works of art that are appreciated in the series. Environmental sound design. The environmental sound design in this game is beyond phenomenal. Every creak of metal, every crash of waves in the ocean, every splash, every footstep, and so much more. The incredible sense of world building and realism that the environmental sounds bring to this game is honestly mesmerizing. Walking on different surfaces or shooting different surfaces creates unique sounds for each material in a very similar and effective manner to how I discussed physical materials in the past. The attention to detail cannot be overstated here. When characters talk in other rooms, their voices are muffled. When you land a jump, you can feel the force being applied to the surface that you land on. There's an eerie dread in the air when the day sits still, and you can feel it every moment thanks to the environmental music. I really could continue on this subject with all of the environmental sounds within each environment of the game, but it's something that should be experienced rather than explained. Free guitar mode. Another aspect of the audio in this game is the free guitar mode. You're able to play a large assortment of chords in any order using the touchpad to hit specific strings. I've seen many people play cover songs on YouTube using this feature, and its addition does add a nice freedom for music lovers to play and even learn. I know I've spent some time making Ellie shred. And how can I talk about the audio without talking about the incredibly sweet cover of Take On Me by Ellie? This alone reignited my interest in playing guitar. I even learned the first chord of the song. But seriously, I really enjoyed this segment, and it was a bold move to put such a touching scene in an optional building. You don't even have to see this scene to have the story continue. And of course, the inclusion of Future Days by Pearl Jam was a great addition to the game as well. I do wish we could have seen more of those future days with Joel and Ellie. That concludes the audio assessment. Just like its predecessor, The Last of Us Part 2 brings in the big guns for not only its musical score, but its environments as well. With the conclusion of covers of Take On Me and Future Days by our favorite characters, I have to say, I believe this is likely the best audio I've ever experienced in a game. And I feel content with giving this section a 10 out of 10. It really does bring out some deep emotions in me. Story and storytelling. Now we've made it to probably the most difficult section of the review for me, the story and storytelling. As an indie game developer, I normally work in teams of 2 to 4 people, and with teams that small, you have your hands in every aspect of those projects. Story is something that I've become experienced with, and I know how hard it is to get right, especially with sequels. I really, truly think that the writers missed the mark with this game's story, and it was the biggest letdown of the game for me personally. But let's get into why. Let's start off with the scene. I assume if you've gotten this far into the review that you've experienced the entire game, so I won't do a full synopsis of the game, but we should start off with the scene that really started off the game in the wrong direction, Joel's death. Joel is a complicated character, but one that fans of the series absolutely love because of his growth in the first game. His father-daughter relationship with Ellie brought his humanity back and brought him to a better place with himself, with his brother, and even brought him to peace with Sarah's passing. But his relationship to Ellie is built on a lie, one of selfishness and one that doomed the world. To see this character who was so brilliantly written, whose past was filled with horrors, but whose future filled with promise, get brutally beaten to death by a group of unknown strangers was in such poor taste that I truly did not want to continue the game at this point. Somehow the story clunkily takes Ellie to where Joel's being tortured just to make her watch her father figure take his last gasp before Abby finishes the deed. It was such an unfitting and undeserved death, I can't imagine writing it. Discarding such an intriguing and nuanced character like garbage, it just feels intentional for shock value. I understand this world is harsh, and I understand that our main characters shouldn't have that much plot armor. But this was poorly handled, and I do hope that Naughty Dog can acknowledge that. Okay, so now that we have that out of the way, we can begin talking about all of the other flaws in the story and storytelling that hamper this game's narrative. But keep in mind that this scene does ruin any appreciation that the player has or can develop for Abby for the remainder of the game, even though we're forced to play as her for a large chunk later on. Structure. One of the key flaws in The Last of Us Part 2's story and storytelling is its structure. Having two characters that you switch to and from is very disjointing in this game. Not only is it because Abby is a character many players will find no sympathy towards and no enjoyment playing as, but because it's actually difficult to keep track of your upgrades and ammo counts and weapons since you switch back and forth so frequently, especially towards the beginning of the game. The character switches also happen at very odd points in the story, the main offender being the major switch from Ellie to Abby at the end of the first Seattle Day 3. The game leaves you on a serious cliffhanger and reverts all the way back to Seattle Day 1, but now from Abby's point of view. And although I see what the team at Naughty Dog was going for, I really think it failed here. The pacing issues that this causes are insurmountable. I was absolutely drained playing those 10 hours as Abby, since I had already played through Seattle Days 1 through 3 immediately before the character switch. These sort of flashbacks and character swaps were one of the main reasons I couldn't enjoy the story in The Last of Us Part 2. The experience simply was not cohesive in its structure. When the game begins the flashback with the Ferris wheel and Owen within Abby's concurrently going flashback that had begun on a cliffhanger, I really just began to dread finishing this portion of the game. Many characters you interact with as Abby, we had already killed as Ellie, so seeing them in Abby's flashback was more odd than emotional, since we already know their fate and actually wished revenge upon them in the first place. Attempting to add humanity to their characters after we already killed them could have been effective, but I don't think the storytelling was strong enough here. I didn't feel much or any remorse for killing them, not even Mel and not even Owen. Another reason the story structure is abysmal in my opinion is because the journey that Abby goes on has almost nothing to do with Ellie's plot. After nearly being executed, Abby saves two Seraphites and makes it her goal to keep them safe. A large chunk of this section is mostly a waste of time, like going to the hospital to find tools for an operation on Yara's shattered arm, when Yara ends up dying a day later anyways. Although I did like this part because of the introduction of the Rat King, like I mentioned earlier. During Abby's story, you witness an intense war between the two factions, the WLF and the Seraphites. But that's mostly forgotten when Abby returns to find all of her friends dead, a complete disconnect from that war plot. And then Abby conveniently finds a map on the floor leading her directly to Ellie. This leads me to my next major issue with the storytelling, the coincidences. Coincidences like the map on the floor are common in this story, and seem like really lazy and uninspired ways to make the story continue unnaturally. More major coincidences are that Joel rescues Abby out of nowhere in the opening 2 hours. He then immediately trusts her and her group, allowing them to jump him. Less obvious things like Abby's entire group wearing WLF patches so they could be followed. Abby leaving Ellie alive twice when she could have killed her just for Ellie to hunt her down and hunt her down again. The coincidences pile up in this story and they just feel overwhelmingly forced in my opinion. A small gripe I have, and this technique was used in the first game but I think it's overdone here, are all of the hard cuts to black that this game uses for scene transitions. They're so frequent and overdramatic in this game due to the constant character swapping, flashbacks, cliffhangers, scene changes, that I did start to find them quite distracting. Also, there's a lot of repetition in the story structure. Multiple sections have characters say, "Follow me, I want to show you something," or "Let's cut through here." And Ellie's Seattle Day 1 and Day 2 end very similarly. Climbing a large building, running from some WLF soldiers into an underground area with red lighting, and an infected encounter where WLF soldiers can be attacked by those infected. These sorts of repetitions made the game feel like it dragged on for me. Lastly, another downside is that the majority of this game takes place in just 3 days, not allowing for much character development for Ellie, in comparison to the first game where it was spread throughout an entire year, so all of the character development and growth was gradual and believable. In this game, Abby does have a change of heart by saving the Scar kids, Yara and Lev, but it's incredibly sudden and extreme. And since it takes place in such a dislike flashback portion of the game, I don't think it hits home for many players. Themes. The structure of the game, as baffling as it seems, was likely chosen in order to emphasize the themes of the story. The first game had 2 major themes, the first being of hope in Ellie. She is our hope for a better world and a potential cure. The second theme is common in zombie culture, that being that even in a world full of ravenous infected, humans are the real monsters. These 2 themes were explored deeply, along with multiple sub-themes in the first game that really hit home for me. However, I can't quite say the same about the themes in this game, mostly because of the storytelling that I mentioned earlier. The Last of Us Part 2 brings back the idea that humans are the real monsters. Humans are explored in this game more so than the actual infected, to my disappointment. I think there was too great of an emphasis put on fighting humans throughout the larger chunks of Seattle and Santa Barbara, and this theme overstayed its welcome. The first major theme, unique from its predecessor, explores the cyclical nature of revenge, and this theme was effective and obvious within the first 3 to 4 hours of the game, but in my opinion, this theme becomes overbearing and heavy-handed by the end of the game due to the game's length. The game keeps bringing it up and reiterating the circle of violence with dialogue and events. They attempt to humanize those that you've killed by giving them names and fleshing out the individuals in Abby's group. I think they could have made this theme land if the audience had an opportunity to spend time with Abby and her group for upwards of maybe 10 hours before the scene happened with killing Joel. And if Joel's murder was actually done in an emotionally powerful way, like Abby taking it too far and infecting him with the virus while torturing him and letting him spend his final day in Jackson with the people he loves, knowing his life is about to end. Or perhaps if the game happened chronologically, it would have worked better and would have been more cohesive. A theme that I think did work for me was the theme of the cost of revenge. Both Abby and Ellie seek revenge in this game. When they get revenge or attempt to get revenge, those characters lose everything. Abby's entire group of close friends is killed by Ellie and Tommy. She loses the love of her life and loses her high-ranking position in a well-established faction, the Wolves. Ellie also seeks revenge and loses her idyllic life on the farm with a happy family. She also loses 3 of her fingers and the ability to play guitar, meaning her last connection to Joel. Revenge is not justice, and I think that's something that both characters eventually learn, even if at inopportune times. Now, I'm not sure if this is an intentional theme, but I do see Abby and Ellie as mirrors to Joel at different points in his life. Abby's story is a recreation of Joel in the first game. She takes on a surrogate child and keeps him safe through all of the mayhem in the world. She redeems her past atrocities in her own eyes by keeping this child safe and taking him to refuge with the Fireflies. Ellie's story is Joel during the 20-year gap in the first game. Joel became a hardened and violent person, losing his innocence in a harsh world full of loss. Ellie follows this journey in this game, and by the end is as empty and hollow and alone as Joel was at the beginning of the first game. Cinematography. Let's talk about those cutscenes. Okay, so we've went on and on about how gorgeous the game looks, but the cinematography displayed in the cutscenes is also Hollywood level fantastic. The cutscenes sport amazing long cuts, phenomenal acting, and a handheld, almost uncontrolled feeling that I love. There are cinematics such as a car scene with Jesse, the island and Haven on fire, and infection hordes chasing you with intense camera shake and incredible camera movement and clarity. These are the types of cinematics that you would expect from a well-respected AAA studio, and Naughty Dog does not disappoint, except with far too many hard cuts to black like I mentioned earlier. Miscellaneous. There are a few miscellaneous story and storytelling elements that I also wanted to bring up. Let's start with the positive ones. Although I disliked how they handled the actual murder of Joel, I really felt the emotions in the scenes immediately afterwards. Seeing Joel's gravestone, the sulking animation overlay on Ellie, the movement speed dialed down to the minimum, the flowers covering Joel's home, exploring his empty house, smelling his jacket just for a moment to be close to him again. It was very emotional for me, and I think it's something that's not being talked about enough. Next, the flashback scenes with Joel are no doubt some of the best portions of the game. Of course, when you remember someone, we do have selective memories, so if we remember them fondly, we'll only remember the best of times. The museum flashback is how you properly do a flashback. Man, was that heartwarming, and it was a true continuation of the first game, and it really worked for me. Another nice touch is when you teleport from state to state, traveling from Wyoming to Seattle to California, or even go into flashbacks. I thought it was a nice touch to add unique and interesting journal entries. I knew that there couldn't be nothing exciting happening between these long journeys, and although I would have rather preferred to actually play in those sections, since the first game taught us traveling across the country can be just as interesting as getting to the destination, the journal entries do give us some insight into those stretches of time. One disappointment I had is that I wish the game explored the differing factions more in the story. Although the Seraphites are in the game for the majority of it, you don't really explore their cult or experience many devotees in great capacity. Also, the Rattlers are used as just another group of evil people doing evil stuff. They're mostly used simply for enemy fodder. At least with the WLF, you do get a few major characters, but none that you particularly care about due to their affiliation with Abby and their cause only briefly being touched on. I would have loved a section where you're trying to kill Abby or another antagonist by running from a large horde of infected, and whoever can outrun or slow down the other first would survive this encounter. Perhaps having Ellie use her immunity to her advantage like she did somewhat against the Rattlers. And touching on that, I do wish Ellie's immunity was explored more. I was really interested in the story when Dina found out about Ellie's immunity, but nothing ever really comes from it, and it's hardly touched on again and never given any real relevance to the story, whereas it was really the cornerstone of the first game. That concludes the story and storytelling section of this review. I could continue with my frustrations, but I think we've explored it enough. Overall, I do believe that the story was mishandled. It was taken in a direction that was somewhat interesting at the best of times, but downright dreadful at the worst of times. It may have been the worst attempt I've ever seen at trying to humanize an antagonist, and although there were bits of story that had me emotional, it wasn't done in an impactful way that really resonates long term. I'm going to give the story and storytelling an 8 out of 30. Characters. The characters in The Last of Us were some of my favorite in video game history. Unfortunately, I can't say the same for Part 2. I want to speak about Ellie and Abby in depth, as they're really the only two characters with real character arcs, and then we'll summarize my opinions on the other minor characters. Ellie. Ellie is my favorite character from the first game, so I'm glad she's one of the playable characters. I really enjoy her relationship with Dina, and I think the romance makes a lot of sense, and is one of my favorite aspects of this game. Ellie playing Take On Me for Dina in the music store was so touching, and moments like that exist throughout Seattle Day 1 and the first part of The Farm. Ashley Johnson once again hits a home run with her acting abilities and superb voice. But the older character of Ellie has changed pretty drastically from her younger, more innocent self. She's much less talkative as an adult and somewhat less interesting due to this. Most of this game, she's so full of hate and lets it get the best of her. It's really difficult to see Ellie go through this transformation while losing everything she loves, but that is the emotion that the writers intended, so I definitely get it. Ellie has multiple designs throughout the game showing her drastic physical transformation from her bubbly teenager version to her broken adult version. I thought that it was a smart move for her to chemically burn her bite mark to hide it and then tattoo over it, that way people don't get suspicious. Getting to Ellie's character arc, it follows a somewhat simple formula, but kind of breaks it. She has a goal to get revenge on Abby, but she's unable to murder Abby. And at this point, instead of letting the past go, she once again ventures out to kill Abby and ends her arc with a different disposition to her original goal. The bad decisions that Ellie made during her arc were difficult to watch on such a revered character, so I do have to say that most of Ellie's main plot did not work for me in this game. Abby. Abby is a new character introduced in The Last of Us Part 2. In a vacuum, I do find her cause sympathetic. Joel killed her father and decimated the Fireflies so badly that the organization had to officially disband, at least in the Salt Lake City region. It only makes sense that she would seek revenge if she had the opportunity. I also like Abby's physical design, although I am in the minority. She's very stocky and built. She's an intimidating woman, but with a real vulnerability due to her fear of heights. Not the most original design, but I do think it works well as a foil to Ellie, who is small and petite, but basically invulnerable to infection and nearly fearless. Laura Bailey did the performance capture for Abby, and I think with the material she was given, she did some great work, especially while fighting the infected like the Rat King. Abby's character arc, like I mentioned earlier, was a small revenge plot in the beginning that turned into Joel's story from the first game, a redemption character arc that really didn't mesh well with Ellie's. But the writers put themselves in a very difficult position here because every redemptive quality that they tried to give Abby would take away the impact of Ellie's revenge. So the two character arcs are in direct opposition to one another, and it would be nearly impossible to have both be effective in the same story. Overall, Abby's character is one of the most disliked in any game I've ever played. I won't lie, I disliked Abby throughout the game and purposefully had her jump off of cliffs and get swamped by infected a few times just to watch her suffer. And my dislike for Abby is not only because she killed Joel, but because her story arc killed a lot of momentum that the story was building up, because it feels like she was forced onto us, because we have to fight our beloved character Ellie while controlling her, and because ultimately she's beaten off screen by the Rattlers and not by us the player. We only get to fight a broken shell of the former behemoth. Okay, let's talk a little bit about minor characters in the game as well, like Joel. Joel was a minor character in this game. Every scene he's in, except for his death, was emotional and felt important. Troy Baker is one of the best actors in the video game industry, and he is an absolute legend in this role. I wish there was more of Joel in the game, but at least in the end, he did get his cup of coffee. Tommy. There's not too much to say about Tommy. He's not a big presence in the game. He doesn't have much of an arc except for losing everything like his marriage, his mobility, and probably even some of his brain matter. It's upsetting how he taunts Ellie to go after Abby at the end, after everything that happens in Seattle. But after losing everything and seeing Ellie living comfortably, I do somewhat understand. Dina. Dina is my favorite new addition in the game. I've already mentioned it, but her relationship with Ellie feels right. There's a real connection there, and it feels like they had a lot of tension built up for a few years while Dina was dating Jesse. I enjoyed the synagogue area, explaining that Dina comes from a long line of survivors. Shannon Woodward did the motion capture and voice work for Dina, and overall, I think it's a fantastic performance and a believable character who was put in difficult positions by Ellie. And I think it's worth mentioning that Dina is the only character in the game, and kind of Jesse, to literally bring life into the world with her baby, JJ. Lev. Lev is an outcasted member of the Seraphites. He is known to the cult as Lily, since he is a transgender character who ran away to be who he truly is. Of course, the cult does not accept this, so he and his sister Yara attempt to escape the cult with their lives and live free, but they appear to not have the survival instincts and skills necessary to make it in this deep and darkened world. Luckily, they both receive assistance from Abby, and I think Lev is a nice addition to the cast of characters. He's pretty oblivious to the old world, which can at times be needed comedy, and he still finds it hard to detach sometimes, from his cult's beliefs, but appears to be a decent person and loyal to Abby. Yara. Yara is the big sister to Lev. Unfortunately, her arm is shattered by a hammer when you first meet her, but she's a fighter and presses on to help her brother survive. Yara is mortally wounded, but her last act returns the favor to Abby as she saves Abby's life by killing Isaac and allowing Abby and Lev to escape the island. I'm terrible because I actually laughed a little bit when Yara died. It did remind me of the movie Inglourious Basterds when they killed Hitler by shredding his face with bullets, and that's kind of what happened to Yara. Now there's some background characters that we should probably talk about as well, like Alice and Bear. Alice and Bear are two background characters. They're actually both dogs. While you're playing as Abby, you spend a lot of your time with Alice, and she's a good girl. You'll also see Bear a little bit from time to time as Abby, however these two poor dogs get killed by Ellie on her revenge mission. You don't have to kill Bear during your playthrough, but Alice is an unfortunate casualty during Ellie's story. Jesse. Jesse seems like a good person and has an amazing silky smooth voice. He's helpful in a fight, but surprisingly gets killed by Abby. Another tragic victim in the circle of violence. Owen. Owen always came off as really bland to me. I never found his character interesting. Even him turning on his own comrade to save a Scar seemed pretty out of place and had no strong relation to the overall story, other than maybe foreshadowing what Abby would then do. His sex scene with Abby was unnecessary in my opinion, although I did think that the game was going to continue with the theme of pregnancy, but no, the sex scene just happens and there's really no point to it. I just didn't care for his involvement in the story, even though he was an overall decent person. Mel, oh my god. So Mel is incredibly mild-mannered and one of the most boring characters in the game. She doesn't really do anything to make you like her or hate her. She's just kind of a tool for tension between Owen and Abby, and maybe a tool for Ellie to feel some sort of regret for her actions. Nora. Hear me out, but I think Nora is underrated in this game. I feel terrible for her. We barely get to see her in the game, but she has got some spunk. I know under the right conditions, she and probably all of Abby's group would have been good friends with the members of Jackson, and that's one of the sub-themes in the game, but it's especially true with Nora. She's incredibly loyal and helpful to Abby, but met one of the worst fates in the game. Manny. Manny is another character that was written to be liked. If the game started on day one of Seattle with Abby, I'm certain people would have had more of an appreciation for him, but the way the story is told, he's just another person in that group that killed Joel. And there's a couple other minor characters that we should mention as well, like Isaac. Like most of these minor characters, he is hardly explored. He's the wolf leader who's waging war on the Seraphites. His performance was done by Jeffrey Wright, in case you thought his voice sounded familiar, but overall we don't really see too much of Isaac. Maria. Maria comes off as a control freak. Kind of like in the first game, she's controlling of Tommy when Joel dies, initially prevents Ellie from going after the WLF, and eventually takes a break from Tommy when he returns from Seattle. Not one of my favorite types of people, but at least she did force Seth to apologize for being bigoted. Seth. Speaking of Seth, he's just the village jerk, but I heard he makes good sandwiches. JJ. JJ is Jesse and Dina's baby. You get to take care of him for a bit at the farm, and he's a little chunkster. He really allows Dina and Ellie to have a happy little life on the farm, and I'm not sure if they mentioned it anywhere, but JJ I think stands for Jesse and Joel. Dialogue and banter. The dialogue between characters was one of my favorite aspects of the first game. Just chatting it up with your favorite characters is a blast. And it works really well in the beginning of this game too. Dialogue between Ellie and Dina, and Ellie and Jesse is always sweet or hilarious or just interesting. Of course, the dialogue and banter between young Ellie and Joel is by far the best in the entire game. I found it interesting that during dialogue with Tommy, he explains that hordes of infected migrate every year through Jackson, but this isn't ever explored or brought up again. But not all the dialogue is good. Things shift halfway through the game when you play as Abby. The dialogue and banter doesn't seem as interesting. You're able to speak with other soldiers or her companions, but since the player isn't invested in Abby or her faction, and she knows the fate of most of Abby's friends, it leaves a lot to be desired. The best dialogue I experienced with Abby was with Lev and Yara, but I still personally prefer the Jackson crowd. That concludes the character analysis section. The characters' actions and the way the audience feels about them are closely linked to the direction of the story. I think that some of the minor characters like Dina, Joel, and Lev are more interesting and enjoyable to see on screen than Abby and even adult Ellie at times. I'm personally not a fan of the story arcs of either Ellie or Abby, our two main characters, and that's a big problem for a narrative. Overall, I feel the characters in this game have great dialogue at times, are interesting at times, but have some major issues. I'm going to grade them an overall 7 out of 15. Gameplay. When talking about a game, you have to bring up the gameplay, the moment-to-moment actions that the player will experience. It is a game after all, and gameplay is the major defining feature that makes it so. Level design. So let's start off with level design in this game. Imagine all of the areas in the game don't have textures and were made from simple plain boxes. That's how we analyze level design. In my opinion, there were some great additions in the environmental design with the use of vehicles as roadblocks while traversing between major locations. There are semi-trucks, cars, bridges, etc. scattered about the regions and are smartly placed to allow for traversal in realistic but still interesting ways, like jumping from the cab to the trailer of a semi-truck or crawling underneath a vehicle to avoid blowing up on some landmines. In some sections, there are environmental puzzles you need to solve to progress or claim additional loot. One great example is the main gate getting into Seattle. Using the same power cord to open the small gate to open the main gate by throwing it over the fence. Although Dina does help you with the solution just a bit too quickly in my opinion. These types of environmental puzzles are incredibly common in the game. Many times they are too obvious to be considered a puzzle, but there were a few that I really enjoyed. I'm sure that you've noticed each area is sectioned off by a level block. These level blocks are either doors with debris behind them, gates that need to be bent, vending machines that need to be moved, etc. There's also vertical level blocks as well, where you jump down off of a railing, down into a basement, slide down a hill, or leap off of a small cliff and can't progress backwards. These level blocks allow developers to free up resources by unloading previous sections of the level. Many of these feel natural, but it does make it difficult to sneak past hordes of enemies when you have to hold triangle through a level block and it gets everyone's attention in the area. One major aspect of improvement in The Last of Us Part 2 are encounter areas. These areas are filled with counters to hide behind, grass to sink into, small cracks to slip through, multiple buildings to run to and from. We'll get into enemies a little bit later, but they ensure that this sense of scale is useful when fighting nearly a dozen enemies in large areas. This improvement was definitely noticeable immediately when I entered Seattle and began fighting the wolves. Combat. Both Ellie and Abby have two distinct types of firearms, primary firearms and sidearms. The primary firearms are larger weapons, such as the bolt-action rifle, pump shotgun, bow, and silenced SMG for Ellie, and the semi-automatic rifle, double-barreled shotgun, crossbow, and flamethrower for Abby. These weapons are slightly easier to wield than the sidearms, and most of them have a significantly higher damage output than the sidearms as well. The only downside being that the ammo can be slightly more scarce with these weapons. Both types of bows can be used for stealth kills from a distance, and both projectile types can be recovered, with the crossbow's projectiles being slightly more durable. I personally enjoy using precision weaponry, so my favorite are the two rifles that the characters have. Ellie's feeling incredibly strong. The sidearms include a semi-automatic pistol and Joel's revolver for Ellie, and the military pistol and hunting gun for Abby. The hunting gun appears to be the strongest, but only has a single shot before you need to reload. Overall, the sidearms feel much more difficult to aim with, and the reticules stay relatively large when crouched, so long-range shooting is nearly impossible. I really enjoy using the firearms in this game, even though there's very little to no auto-aim assistance by default. One of my favorite details is also that different weapons will yield different types of gore, the most graphic I've seen being completely erasing someone's head with a close-range shotgun blast. The gun handling appears to be in line with the idea of survival horror. It's purposefully difficult to aim most weapons. This isn't Fortnite or Metal Gear Solid 5. You can't run and gun your way to victory most times. The gun handling forces you to be methodical, and I appreciate that. The combat in the game also has multiple throwable explosives such as Molotov cocktails, stun grenades, smoke grenades, pipe bombs, and even snowballs and cables are handled with the same throwing mechanic. There are also trap mines that you're able to use for enemies that are chasing you. Lastly, bottles and bricks can be picked up off the floor and thrown to stun enemies. Most of these make a return from the first game and have very similar mechanics. The melee combat in this game is overall very similar to the first game. Weapons like crowbars or machetes can be used on enemies of all types but have limited durability. The action of meleeing by hitting square is still nearly instantaneous. Melee weapons are able to be slightly upgraded in the crafting menu still as well. Infected, such as runners and stalkers, have the ability to grab you at close range. A basic QuickTime event plays, and all you have to do is mash the square button to get loose. This could have been explored a little bit more deeply and maybe switched between different buttons, as I think this is a little bit too simple. There are, however, two major additions to the regular combat in the game. The first being the bruiser combat fights. There's only a couple, but fighting these small mini-bosses with melee weapons warms up the player for the final confrontation against Abby in Santa Barbara. And one of the main aspects of bruiser combat is the new dodge mechanic. The dodge mechanic can be used anytime you have standard control over your character. A quick L1 tap will have you dodging incoming melee attacks instantly. This does make the game slightly easier if you can time the dodges well, but overall I think it's a nice layer to the melee system. The melee system is fairly simplistic and can feel like a get out of jail free card if you have a full machete or something up your sleeve, but the cinematic quality to it still makes it a fantastic close-up encounter system. Stealth has always been a large part of The Last of Us. You're incentivized to kill enemies without using resources, and stealth killing them is an easy way to do that. This game added going fully prone and crawling for another layer of stealth, although most of the time crouching really does get the job done. Ellie is overall much more effective at sneaking because she can stealth kill clickers indefinitely with her knife, while Abby needs to craft a shiv each time she wants to take a clicker down. Neither character, however, can stealth kill a shambler or a bloater. They're just too large, so you have to resort to traditional combat methods to take them down. The sneaking works similarly to the first game. Moving your character slowly generates less noise than moving quickly. Indicators on screen will show you if an enemy is detecting you, what direction that enemy is in. I love the little gong sound that plays whenever you've been detected by enemies. It lets you know things are about to get real. Another aspect of stealth is moving behind an enemy allows you to grab them. Grabbing an enemy gives you a few options. You can stealth kill them, you can take a little walk with them before they break free, or you can shoot them with your sidearm. Overall, stealth can make sections of the game pretty easy as well. It's definitely something that you should be focusing on during your playthrough. I appreciate its design, but I do still wish there were less level blocks after each area, as it can be difficult to sneak by large hordes of enemies and progress without killing them all, like I mentioned earlier. Resource management. The game has a large emphasis on resource management. Trying to scavenge everything you can and use as little as you can is the name of the game on harder difficulties. Fans of the first game will find this mentality familiar. Crafting in this game is incredibly similar to its predecessor. Resources can be found and used. Some resources can be used to craft different items, making that resource an important commodity. There are a few different types of resources, and a nice detail is that each type has a different sound when you pick them up. Weapons can be upgraded just like before at workbenches, and I was impressed with this feature because it gets interrupted by enemies in an apartment complex at one point in the game, and it's difficult to have menus work seamlessly like that with dynamic interruptions. Hats off for that. But anyways, the weapon upgrade system should be familiar to fans of the first game. Use scavenge parts to upgrade your weapon. Similar to upgrading weapons, you can find supplements to unlock abilities in your skill tree. Once again, should be very familiar. However, there are different skill trees that will be unlocked throughout the game when you find training manuals. But let's talk about the act of scavenging in this game. I appreciate the hidden items inside of vending machines and refrigerators and other glass enclosures that you can only scavenge if you break the glass, and at first I found myself scavenging a lot, checking every corner of the game trying to find every last scrap that I can use. However, with the length of the game, this became incredibly tedious, and I just stopped searching as hard or as often about 10 hours in. The areas are much larger than in the first game, which is amazing, but that also means that you spend a significantly larger amount of time traversing those areas just looking for resources. The areas are gorgeous and I love the designs, but doing it so often for so long through such large areas, it really just wasn't worthwhile. One last thing I would change about scavenging is the icon for pickups when your inventory is full. Currently, when you're full on a specific resource and you see another piece of it in the environment, it'll look normal, but it'll have large red letters underneath saying full. But when you're speeding through an area, it would be much more helpful if the whole icon was just red with a strike through it instead. When the normal icon is in the corner of your screen, it can kind of trick you momentarily. Just a small change, but it's something I think would have made collecting pickups visually easier to understand. Character locomotion. Alright, so let's discuss different character locomotion states that the playable character can assume. Usually in a video game, it's helpful to have common states your character is able to go in and out of, so they can easily be programmed to transition through those states to interact with the environment. It appears that there's only a few locomotion states that your character can be in during the course of the game. In each of these states, some abilities can be disabled, such as your ability to sprint, jump, crouch, climb ledges, go prone, melee, craft items, pull out a map, equip weapons, and aim weapons. Although these abilities being disabled in specific states is not consistent throughout the game, likely because at some points in the game you don't have weapons or haven't completed a tutorial area yet. But most states appear to have the ability to interact with the environment, like picking up items or starting dialogue. The first state we should talk about is the combat state. In this state, all locomotion options are available. This is most likely what you think of as general gameplay. The next most common state is the cinematic state. In this state, you can usually only walk, and it's generally a slower pace than normal. An example of this is at Joel's gravesite. All locomotion abilities are disabled except walking. However, when you get to the street, you're able to pull out your journal. This state is used quite often during exposition-heavy scenes or just before something dramatic occurs. The next state we should discuss is the climbing state. This state is used by characters when climbing ladders and cables. Everything is disabled except camera movement, sprinting to increase climb speed, and the joystick to climb higher and lower. Some cables allow you to swing with R1 along with the joystick being pressed forward and backwards. Of course, we have the horseback riding state. In this state, you assume control of Shimmer for movement. However, you can still use your map and shoot your gun in most cases. I personally was pretty interested in this one because I've never programmed a game where the player possessed and could control two separate actors at the same time before. I think most games with horseback riding have some sort of state for this. I'll have to remember to learn to do something like this. Next, we have the QuickTime event state. Basically, it's a cutscene, but it checks to see if you're pounding the right button, then chooses to display different outcomes leading to either progression or game over. This happens multiple times during cinematics and also happens when you're grabbed by certain types of enemies. Speaking of combat, we also have the knockdown combat state. Your character can get pushed on their back if they're damaged by enemies. From this position, you can aim and fire your weapon like regular combat. As soon as you stop aiming, you will transition back to regular combat state. And lastly, we have the swimming state. In the swimming state, you can swim above water indefinitely or below water for a limited period of time. Overall, the locomotion states don't add or subtract from the review score. I thought it might just be interesting to discuss the different character states in the game in an effort to more thoroughly understand the systems behind the scenes. Enemies. There are a lot of different types of enemies in this game. Each faction has different classes of enemies. There are boss battles, there are dogs, there are loads of infected types. I'm genuinely impressed by the sheer variety of enemies on display in this game. Let's begin this topic by talking about general enemy AI. In my experience, the AI was generally capable. They were quick to dismantle me when I was spotted, and some sections required careful planning. However, some enemies I encountered were nearly blind and couldn't see me in grass standing 10 feet in front of them. It's also a little bit unbelievable that your ally is completely invisible, but I think that's a better design choice than having them likely get spotted every 5 seconds. The enemies do react to seeing their dead colleagues and even call out their names in disbelief. The enemies are constantly cautious while scouting an area. I think the human AI in the game is actually pretty good. Enemies can also be downed and finish off with gruesome detail, but I did have one encounter where I let a downed enemy recover, and they just ran around unarmed. The gong sound played every time she detected me, but she just continued to run away and hide. I'm not sure what that was all about. Fighting the infected is by far my personal favorite part of combat in this game. These are by far the most interesting group of enemies to me. I would love to just roam the vast Jackson, Wyoming, and work with the locals to exterminate the infected in the region. But that's just me. I enjoy fighting the infected a lot. The wide variety of infection types adds a necessary variety and complexity as well. One specific incident that I remember enjoying was when I blew off an infected's lower body with a trap mine and was very surprised to see its torso continuing to crawl after me. Incredible. Also, later in the game in Santa Barbara, you're able to let loose some infected on the Rattlers. And those infected run rampant over the gang. Truly satisfying to see and one of my favorite sections of the game. There are a few boss battles in the game, such as the bloater on day 3 as Ellie, the fight against Ellie as Abby, the fight against the Rat King, and multiple bruiser melee fights. I thought most of these were great inclusions, especially the Rat King encounter. However, I did not enjoy the boss fight against Ellie. I purposefully lost quite a few times as Abby. I don't think it was a smart move to pit a new disliked character against an old beloved character while the player controls the disliked character. I can see it being effective under other circumstances, like with most things in this game, but unfortunately the way it was done just didn't work for me. Most likely because Ellie's entire story was driven by the need to kill Abby, so playing as Abby during the fight felt like the opposite of what should be happening. Overall, the enemies are pretty well done in the game. There's a large assortment to fight all throughout the game. I even appreciated pelting those kids with snowballs. They got destroyed. Allies. Your allies in the game are pretty serviceable as well. Allies can help you in battle by pointing out nearby enemies. They can assist you in killing enemies either by sneaking behind them with you or in an all-out shootout. Most allies are much more helpful than they are a hindrance, and they also usually have interesting dialogue and banter that we spoke about earlier. Most allies are pretty good at getting out of your way and avoiding collision with you. They'll jump back immediately when you get close in order to avoid you most of the time. Overall, most allies are pretty useful. I'd rather travel the wasteland with a friend than alone. Not all of them can be as great as Ellie from the first game, though.
Nothing is that spectacular.
Collectibles. This game has quite a few collectibles as well. Not only do you collect unique trading cards and notes, there are unique trinkets scattered throughout the game and safes to open. I found myself reading quite a few notes in the game, but mostly ones written by civilians or Seraphites. Abby's reactions to some of the Seraphite notes are genuinely hilarious, but I did definitely skip quite a few WLF notes throughout my playthrough. Not really interesting for me. This takes me back to my issue with scavenging in general. At first, it's great to explore this world, but after hours and hours of scouring empty, vacant buildings, usually finding nothing, the task of scavenging does get a little old after a while. I do appreciate the small interactions that you can have with the cards and trinkets and notes though, being able to view them and flip them over, in some case literally signing in on a scouting notebook or signing out on a rented weapon. The collectibles in this game don't really add much to the experience for me, but there are plenty of players that enjoy collectathons, and this may help them relive the good old days. Theatrics. There's another section of gameplay I'm going to call Theatrics for more miscellaneous gameplay elements. I do want to talk about the open world area from a gameplay perspective here. I thought this portion of the game was great. Exploring that area with Dina and being able to roam free felt a little more linear than most open world games, but still very freeing. I wish there was more sections like it in the game, but the game goes back to its linear formula very quickly. The death scenes in the game are very well done. I also enjoy those bits of animation showing your character's tragic fate due to your mistake. I think the death scenes add a lot of weight and show the severity of your choices and actions. Plus, some of them I genuinely got a chuckle out of when I accidentally jumped off a ledge or something. There are a few gameplay sections that I'd probably call a cinematic shootout. This includes the car ride with Jesse and the car ride with Manny, and a few other sequences where your movement is determined by the cinematic. However, you're still fully able to proceed in combat with your firearms. You're given unlimited ammo during these sequences, so feel free to go nuts. We already talked a little bit about horseback riding, but I thought it was well implemented in this game and pretty cinematic overall. Poor Shimmer, she was such a good girl. I do have to say that the obstacle avoidance in this game is much better than in Red Dead Redemption 2. While on horseback, I didn't directly run into any trees at all. Another animal gameplay feature has to do with dogs. You're able to play fetch and pet some dogs. Although it's simple triangle interactions and you throw them like explosives, everyone loves dogs, so how can you not enjoy this feature? There are a few mini-games as well, like starting a generator, a snowball fight, playing fetch once again, closing a window in your house, rounding up some sheep, all little tiny gameplay features that someone had to put in the game. I appreciate them trying to keep a variety of different activities available in the game. And this game has two gameplay features that are exclusive to the PlayStation 4 controller, the first one being able to play the guitar with the touch bar, and the second being a feature from the first game, recharging your battery on your flashlight by shaking the controller. The Last of Us Part 2 really is a PlayStation 4 exclusive because porting over those two features would be pretty difficult to do in a way that's immersive. Of course, you can always replace those actions with just a simple button press, but that would take away the magic. That concludes our discussion on the gameplay features in the game. Overall, I think there's a really good mix of combat and resource management, multiple enemy types, and mini games to keep the game fresh, even if it does drag on for long periods of time. But like many games, there are areas for improvement. I think a score out of 21 out of 25 is reasonable since I had a really good time with the actual gameplay during my playthrough. Technicals. An aspect of game reviews I see that are often missed completely are the technicals. This is all of the hard work that the developers put in to allow the game to actually run. First, let's start off with the flashy stuff. Major animations. The major animation work and motion capture in this game is superb. The cutscenes in the game, as we've already talked about, are top-notch. The performances and animation within them are lifelike. The combat animations are intense. There's always a sense of urgency when you need to run from the infected. The melee animations are gruesome without delay. Gunfire feels powerful with an excellent kick. The reticles react to the firing state. Locomotion animations are generally smooth with smooth transitions between them. The idle animation has a decent variety, although I did notice Ellie wipes her mouth a little more often than most people do. But overall, the major animations are fantastic and of an incredibly high caliber. Minor animations. There are dozens of minor animations in the game as well. Picking up materials, supplements, parts in the environment look great with the character's hand grabbing each piece and physically putting it in her bag, similar to Red Dead Redemption 2. When the character gets near a ledge, they'll begin to wobble, indicating you'll soon fall if you continue to hold that direction. Joel will block out the sun with his hand if you look at the sun in the opening of the game. However, this does not continue, so it must be a scripted event. The physics-driven animation overlays when opening doors and cupboards looks great. I've heard glitches can occur with it, but I haven't encountered any. There's a detailed drowning animation that occurs, even in flashbacks. Ellie and Abby both have a satisfying roll-up animation for cables and ropes. That's a pretty nice touch, didn't need to be in there. There are a lot of nice bits of detail in this game. But there's only one health pack animation, and the character always heals in the same location. Unlocking certain gates, like the main gate, is pretty choppy. After you select a number, the animation must finish playing completely before you can continue, and although swinging on a cable looks great, the jumping animation and landing can be a little choppy as well. But I know better than most people, dealing with cables is difficult. Overall, I'd say the minor animations, for the most part, are very good. Standard. There are many standard game features included in The Last of Us Part 2 that are never talked about, but I think they should be acknowledged and appreciated as well. Each piece of the game has considerable time and effort put into it, so we should at least mention those parts. And although they may not change our opinion about the game, they are important in their own right. The game has multiple difficulty settings, and each difficulty changes the amount of damage you take, the enemy AI, your allies' usefulness, your stealth capabilities, and the amount of resources that are available to scavenge. All of those options can be individually customized with the new custom difficulty setting as well, which I loved and I've used for a more difficult playthrough while maintaining a reasonable amount of resources. The chapter and encounter selection returns from the first game. Although it's simple enough to load a level to replay an encounter, you always have to make a choice as to how to load out the character when a player selects this option. It's a balancing act. I did notice an issue where after you beat the game, if you load a chapter selection or encounter selection or start a new game plus, at that point you're unable to load future chapter selections or encounter selections until you reload your completed game save file. This seems like an oversight where the chapter selections are only unlocked by the current save state and not a separate set of variables. Unlockables are available in the game, including concept art and 3D models with a special model viewer. This allows you to appreciate all of the different versions of each character, including the infected. Ellie has a journal with unique journal entries relating to different encounters, conversations, and experiences she has. Creating a journal in the game with such fidelity and interactions is a welcome addition. The same can be said about her map with the open world area in Seattle. I love how Ellie pulls it out and writes onto it in conjunction with the state of your exploration. I know I have a project that I'm working on that requires a similar map experience, so I'm glad I have a visually stunning and functional option to learn from. Controller vibrations are an amazing addition to the game, and one of the main reasons I recommend playing the game rather than watching it. There are different levels and types of vibrations. Soothing vibrations such as galloping a horse, or sharp vibrations for firing weapons, and intense vibrations for moments of action. Throwable items like the Molotov cocktail will have its arc change color depending on if it's close enough to damage you or not. This little bit of detail helps the player make quick life or death choices in the heat of battle, even though it seems like a small addition. Okay, the rest of these are so minor the vast majority of people won't appreciate them at all, but the on-screen graphics should be pointed out as well, what we would use widgets for in Unreal. The main menu screen is pretty boring, literally being 3 options with plain text and a scene rendered in the background. This is standard for a lot of games, but I do love impressive main menu screens like the one from Call of Duty Black Ops. There's an entire tutorials section with unique graphics and cues with directions. These tutorials also appear on screen if you die in game, usually linked to the cause of your death. As someone who has created death screens before, it's not as simple as you think for specific deaths to have the right screen displayed. There's an unseen indicator in the backpack, that tiny yellow dot letting the player know that there's a new or unseen option there for them. I actually always dislike these in games because I hate having that little symbol there or taking the time to inspect everything in my inventory just to get rid of it. There are a couple interaction-based on-screen graphics as well, and I think they're very smooth. The drawers in the game have a small animation that plays with a circle morphing into an interactable triangle, the circle letting you know that the drawer can be interacted with, and the triangle showing you that you're now within range. This is never explicitly said anywhere in game, but it's intuitive to figure out. Also, the interaction radius and notification of nearby items being correctly localized on screen based on their direction is pretty impressive. When the items leave your interaction radius, they smoothly fade out as well. Very nice touch. The autosave feature in this game is also incredible. I don't think there was a single time I had to replay more than a minute of gameplay thanks to the autosave feature. Truly amazing. The loading screen in this game is pretty lazy in my opinion, and yes, it's loading screen because there's only one. It's just a blurry background with a light source and some moths. I'm not sure if it's a pretentious metaphor for the circle of violence, as if we're all moths driven to the flame of revenge. But either way, I think they could have done more with it, or just left it as a black screen since there are a lot of cuts to black. The pulsing circular loading bar on the loading screen also seems to fill in at erratic rates, but I understand some assets do take much longer to load than others. Okay, that's it for all the basic stuff you'd come to expect and take for granted in any game you purchase, but what are some unique technicals in this game? Unique. I've never seen so many accessibility options ship in a final game like this before. It's truly impressive just how many accessibility options there are in this game. And many of these features are fully customizable in their own right, such as subtitles. Subtitles can have different sizes, different colors, can state the name of the person talking, have a direction indicator of where the sound is coming from, can have background for the text, have an outline for the text. I'm blown away at all of these options. I'm so glad that Naughty Dog did something like this. There are way too many people out there that can't play video games due to a hearing impairment or vision loss, and they aim to assist those in need with these options. I don't want to go through all of the accessibility options because it would take about another 30 minutes to go in depth on them, but I'll leave a link below in case you want to see what options there are. Photo mode makes its return with a few more options than ever. I think it was a smart idea for the studio to use the existing PlayStation 4 screen capture ability to allow for photo captures, although I didn't see any directions explicitly state to use that. When a character plays the guitar, the fingers are on the correct notes, just like in the movie Coco, even when you play the guitar free mode. Changing chords has that realistic scratchiness from the fingers running against the strings. I'm so glad they didn't use some simple music program for this. I'm sure this took hours of animation capture and also a deep understanding of music, so I'm impressed. Opening safes is also something fairly unique. The clicks are accurate as well. If you randomly stumble on the correct digit, a distinct click sound will occur. Overall, there are a few unique features Naughty Dog put into this game that I thoroughly enjoyed, and I hope the accessibility features will compel other studios to include them in their future titles. Glitches. But no games are flawless when it comes to the technicals. I also encountered a couple bugs while playing the game, none of which were outright game-breaking, but there were a couple that broke the immersion a little bit. The first one that I noticed immediately is that there are no subtitles for enemies that you grab. This may not be a glitch, it could be intentional, but literally every word is correctly subtitled in the game except for grabbed humans. I also ran into some collision issues with character models at times, not only with Shimmer when she goes on top of a bush or a ledge, but also with Joel during a flashback scene. These types of collision issues are hilarious though, so I actually kind of hope they don't patch these out. There was one spot in the underground subway system where Dina was standing near a ledge and had issues knowing where to put her legs, whether it should be on the ground or on the ledge. I've also run into this issue whenever I use data-driven animation and inverse kinematics. This normally affects the collision of the lower half of the model as well, although I couldn't really test it on Dina. Other collision-based issues arose when I jumped into a small pinched-off area. For a few moments, Ellie would just fly in the air until suddenly landing. I thought I could push Shimmer out of the way, but apparently Shimmer doesn't react like other NPCs. I've also seen cases of textures disappearing due to some culling issues. I'm pretty sure the textures disappear based on the camera distance, but it's either not calculating correctly or perhaps it's based on a culling volume that's set to the wrong size. Another small glitch I found was that I was able to bypass the friendly fire option with a Molotov. After Dina reveals that she's pregnant, she takes a nap, and if I aim a Molotov or any throwable item extremely high, I'm able to have it land either directly on her or very close. I've also noticed that there are times where glitches happen and animations to affected items lower in frame rate to around 10 frames per second. It's possible that minor animations are keyframed and interpolated between those major keys, but when the glitches occur, no interpolation happens. And this is probably not a glitch, but the game is pretty finicky when jumping off of ledges. When I jump off of a ledge and I'm holding a certain direction, sometimes my character will jettison off in a different direction for some reason. It could be because I enter that wobbling animation for a frame or two, and the jump happens with momentum going in the wobbling animation's forward direction. And that concludes the technical side. I hope that its discussion wasn't too boring for you. These are the types of things that I think about when I play games now in an attempt to learn from them and improve projects that I'm a part of. Overall, the programming in the game is not perfect, but it's pretty close on a lot of aspects. The glitches do exist and they're fun to exploit, but they aren't game-breaking, and you can always reload a very recent autosave. I think the technical section earns a solid at 9.5 out of 10. Conclusion. And so now we can conclude the review. I think I use this review as a therapeutic outlet to get out my mixed feelings about this game. Every part of me wants to love this game, and there are some incredibly touching moments, but the game so consistently let me down with its story and the way that it told that story. I wasn't sure how I felt about the game overall because of these conflicting feelings, so I'm glad I was able to quantify my experience here, and I want to thank you for joining me through that analysis. At this point, we have each major section of the game reviewed and analyzed, and we have a numeric score to represent my opinion on it. If we add each section together, we get a final score of 64.9 out of 100. And this translates on my scoring system to a slightly above average game. And I think that's fitting. The numerical value doesn't tell the whole story, as we've covered. The visuals and audio designs are incredible, some of the best ever, and the gameplay and technicals were very good as well. But the story and characters were really mishandled, and in a story-driven game, that is not something that the audience will take lightly. I enjoyed The Last of Us Part 2 overall, I think. I'm definitely glad I played it, but if a sequel comes out, I'm going to wait for the user reviews before deciding whether or not to purchase it. I appreciate you watching. If you enjoyed this review, please like the video, comment down below, maybe subscribe to the channel. Hopefully you either learned something or thought about the game from a different perspective. I'm here doing my best to help you think like a game developer, even when you're playing video games, so stick around for more videos like this.